Hello, everyone. I'm calling in from a place I have come to know as Sagna, a place that has been called home by the Tongva, Chumash, Quiche, and Gabrielino peoples for over 7,000 years. Less than 200 years ago, settlers named it Los Angeles, California, USA. And our minds can't really comprehend the span of 7,000 years, or even 200 years. But when I think about this past 1 year and how deeply into the distance it seems to have stretched, when I think about all that I've experienced and learned and also worry to have missed, it still escapes me how for over 7,000 years people have lived and dreamt and felt things and cared for one another and stewarded the land and water and living forms such that today I can turn to my left and see a blue sky, hear birds chirp, and smell the sea breeze. I honor this history. I honor the weight of being a guest who has been able to safely shelter in place here. I'm so grateful to join you from where I am. My name is Adriel Luis. My family comes from Toisan by way of Hong Kong, and I grew up in the United States to become a community organizer who writes, makes art, and curates. It is my pleasure to be invited by the Bagri Foundation to speak with two brilliant minds, Amrita Jhaveri and John Studzinski, both people who understand art not only as something valuable, but as invaluable, who recognize the ways that creativity and capital can conspire in incredible ways to uplift humanity. Together, we're capping off Bagri Foundation's series of programs, Navigating Change, which addresses the teeny tiny task of re-envisioning the arts. And as I began thinking about how to lead a conversation around navigating risk and reward, I have to admit, I was kind of thrown off by multiple things. First, the word navigating. I've been on lockdown, yo. I haven't seen a plane, I haven't been on a plane in over a year, and I've learned to plan grocery runs 3 days in advance. Before the pandemic, I identified as a traveler. I split the last 6 months before quarantine among 3 continents while living out of a suitcase. It feels like a past life, but not long ago, my world revolved around literal navigation. Make this flight, take an Uber over there, watch myself as a blue dot gliding across the map while setting up my itineraries for the next 2 trips ahead. And then the world stopped. Last April, just 2 months after my partner and I moved into Los Angeles, we found ourselves driving across town to her family's home in order to see her father get taken away in an ambulance. My entire family-in-law was infected with COVID. And although most only had minor symptoms, my father-in-law spent 3 weeks in a coma. 3 long weeks for 1 long year in a history that spans millennia. We spent morning to night Googling for information about a disease nobody knew anything about, while waiting for a doctor to call us with an update or some dreadful news. We found comfort on Reddit forums, sought advice from friends whose families had been through similar experiences, and tuned into Zoom calls to learn Navajo and Chinese breathing exercises. A year ago today, I was probably sitting in this room, sitting in front of this computer, but I was in such a different place. With so much on the line, everything was at risk, even hope. If asked a year ago how I might find some reward out of my circumstances, I would have been at a loss. Last Monday, we visited my in-laws for the first time, fully vaccinated, to celebrate 1 year since the day we called the ambulance. I asked my wife, shouldn't we be celebrating the day he got back from the hospital? To which she replied, we're Filipino. We probably celebrate that day too. I know now that all of these moments, especially the ones where it seemed like everything is at risk, all these moments are our rewards, worth celebrating. Because what is all this grief and worry for, if not for the reward of spending another moment in this history that spans millennia deep? I'm so excited to hear from Amrita and John about the risks they've taken and what they found most rewarding. But first, I wanted to share how this past year's experience has transformed my curatorial experience and vision for art. A month before that night we called the ambulance, in the very beginning, when crises were being declared and toilet paper was disappearing off of shelves, and individuals who no longer need be named were throwing out terms like China virus, I was watching all of this from my position as a curator at the Smithsonian Asian Pacific American Center, trading helpless glances between my inbox and Instagram feed, feeling like we should do something, anything. But so much of what I was seeing online felt reactionary, and rightfully so. A rapidly spreading disease and skyrocketing violence against Black and Asian people requires urgent action. But I was already exhausted. Years of traveling and producing big public projects and other things that I described as giving me life had actually worn me down. Those first few weeks of the pandemic, feeling like I needed to contribute to something, but not knowing what or how to offer it, that was its own eternity. But while sitting in my exhaustion and uncertainty, I found that what energized me still was the community of artists I cultivated over the years, who approached this moment by caring for one another. I saw artists step up to introduce people to meditation, musicians hold bedroom concerts, painters give studio tours on their phones, all for the purpose of giving people a light in the dark, a reward for navigating through the risk. I realized then that although I didn't have it in me to respond in a timely manner, I could respond in a thoughtful one. I reached out to artists who my colleagues and I had collaborated with in past years to create works that incorporated healing practices. We represented these works as the Smithsonian APA Care Package, featuring videos, poetry, meditations, and music made to nourish during a time of need. I intended to build the website over the course of a weekend, worried that if I didn't rush, that the pandemic would be over by the time it was complete. But everything within me insisted that I embody a slower pace. And when the exhibition finally opened several weeks later, the main response from the public was that it came right on time. Since then, I've become only interested in working on art projects that hold healing properties, art that calls us to risk slowing down, to embrace the reward of savoring each moment and each other. All my life, I've been drawn to art because of its ability to inspire, to impress, to confound, and to incite action. But it took a global pandemic for me to embrace art for its greatest power, which is to simply be there when we most need it, when all else feels lost, when everything else seems broken. Art helps us become whole again.
I founded the Genesis Foundation over now 20 years ago to focus on nurturing and encouraging, mentoring and motivating emerging artists and also emerging audiences. And there's no question that the last year has really underscored to me why I created and set up and founded the Genesis Foundation in the first place. Everyone listening to this presentation had a moment or moments in their life when someone took risk, someone took a chance, someone held their breath and gave you a break. They believed in you, they respected you, they wanted to perhaps support your dignity, And what they did was they gave you an internship, an apprenticeship, a job. They brought you onto their team. They gave you a scholarship, or they did something as a creative individual to help you take your career forward. In the last year, we've set up a number of projects, in particular, beyond our normal remit at the Genesis Foundation, to nurture young artists, and in this case, to nurture freelancers, because we're conscious of the fact that during the COVID period, a testing period, a challenging period, many arts organizations have had to pause, close, and withdraw from active engagement with their audiences. Many artists' shows have been postponed or canceled. So we set up a Kickstart fund encouraging artists to put forward proposals and programs and ideas, and we're funding those actively to the tune of several £million over the next 12 months. The thing I've learned over the last 20 years is that while capital does chase culture, and we all know that, capital wants to be in a place where culture exists. So remember that, all of the artists listening, capital will chase culture because we cannot live without culture. It nurtures the soul and it nurtures civilization. On the other hand, we all know, particularly in this environment, as I've just said, that culture chases and needs capital. They're sort of strange bedfellows. They're partners, they're affiliates, and they have good times together and they have awkward times together. But in terms of risk, the thing I've learned, secondly, about the Genesis Foundation and the creative process is everyone listening and all the artists out there, and we've touched the lives of over 10,000 creative talents over the last 20 years and given away over £30 million of resources and money. The thing I've learned is it's about nurturing the artist's self-confidence and self-esteem. You might be interested to know that when Walt Disney started his career, he actually was sacked for lacking imagination from a couple of newspapers as someone who had no unique thoughts. Walt Disney, as you know, went on to win 22 Academy Awards and obviously created some iconic characters following on the sort of footsteps of Mickey Mouse and Donald Duck and some of the great fantasies of the 20th century, including the notion of the arts in America as being focused on visual imagery. The Beatles in the UK initially were rejected by Decca as having no interesting sound and no promising. They persevered, and of course we know the rest is history. So risk and the creative process are also two important bedfellows. And again, the more creative you are, the more risks you need to take in partnership with either capital, nurturing mentors, and the third thing, which I really subscribe to, networks. Creative artists cannot do anything, particularly as they're experimenting, unless they have feedback, sounding boards, and groups of people with whom they can discuss, collaborate, and persevere. Thomas Edison, who you all have heard of, who founded General Electric, who was a great American innovator, he took the view that innovation was about 99% perspiration or effort and 1% inspiration. And I think, if anything, good philanthropy in the arts, particularly in COVID, particularly at a time when I know many in the arts world and the creative industries have had to think carefully about whether to remain and persevere or turn away. I know a very creative set designer, perhaps one of the best set designers in London, who actually had, because he was out of work, he got a job with Network Rail as a lighting technician. His compensation was 3 times what he was getting in the theater, and he was enabled to feed his family in a very, very successful way. We don't want people to drop out of the creative process during this period, and we don't want this pandemic to destroy an important part of cultural creative history. And when we look at emerging industries and we look at emerging talent, I think we also have to remember one other partnership. Crises need opportunity, and opportunity needs crises. And we're operating in a period where I actually think we're going to look back at this period in the arts and say, wow, that was an incredibly good period, because it taught people that it's not necessarily about just capital. It's all about giving time. It's giving their talent. The art of volunteering, I think, as we've seen with Captain Sir Tom in the UK, has evolved. And it's also, to a certain extent, teaching people that so much about the human condition is inherently good. And I think sometimes during a period of crisis, we often take that for granted. So I'm invigorated by the work we've done in the last 20 years. I'm very excited about this next phase of the evolution of the arts, not just from a philanthropic point of view, because I think the philanthropy has to evolve from just about giving money or treasure to people giving more time, sharing their talents, particularly if they've got talents in technology or networks, as I said earlier, or also trust. So remember, supporting a young emerging artist, particularly at a time like this, is about trust. It's about respecting the individual's creative talent to make a long-term contribution to cultural memory, to focus on nurturing them, hugging them creatively, supporting them, and making sure you know that they will succeed. And it's that type of support, more than anything else, that we need during this period. There's nothing more important. And when you think about risk, I want you to look at the current moment and say, this will be a great opportunity, because we're on the advent of not only a technology revolution and evolution, but I think a spiritual revolution that'll be very much manifest in the arts. Thank you.
Oh, that was very moving to listen to Adriel and also to John. I thought I'd do things a bit differently and speak a little bit maybe more directly to the prompts that that the Bagri Foundation very kindly laid out as a way just of structuring this. So the first question was, what are the professional and personal teachings you have learned from this shared experience of 2020? So I'd say professionally and personally, I've learned to stand still, to slow down, take a deep breath, give up control, experiment, and most importantly, to collaborate. The pandemic has emboldened me to show art in less narrow ways and to be more open-minded overall. I think it's generally accepted that in India, we had the most stringent of lockdowns in the world last year, with little or no support, government support at all. As a small cultural business, we were left to fend for ourselves. Unlike our UK counterparts, there was no furlough or rent reductions in a city like Bombay, which is notoriously expensive. So my first instinct was for preservation of the business and our small but loyal staff who didn't have access to healthcare, were unable to come to work, as commuter trains were out of service. The risk here is that without them, we wouldn't have a business and couldn't support our artists. So we decided to deploy all our savings and prioritize paying full salaries regardless, and full rent, regardless of whether anybody could come to work or not. With shows cancelled and studios at a standstill, our next concern was for our artists and their financial and emotional well-being. So we called on our best clients, collaborated with our competitors, other galleries, to sell works by these artists at attractive values. For instance, in London, I collaborated with Tim Taylor, Southard Reed, and Kate McGarry, who represent some of the artists we've shown in India. I felt this way we could support our artists, our colleagues, and ourselves. We sort of stopped worrying about the gallery exhibition schedule because this was always at the forefront. We were always running from one show to the next. And encourage artists to continue making work, even if we were not certain that we could show it. One of the risks inherent in our program is that many of our artists are women, and they've borne the brunt of the lockdown with homeschooling and caring for elderly parents or young children. Work in their studio has come to almost a standstill. For some artists, it's been an opportunity to focus on longer term projects. So I've encouraged an artist whose studio assistants couldn't come in to maybe take the time out and think about making a book about her work, which hadn't been done. For others, it's allowed them to experiment with new media, be it animation or works on paper. With fairs cancelled, we went headlong onto online viewing rooms, many of which were free. We were initially very excited about this space and spent time thinking about it, thinking about what would be suitable in this format. And quickly learned we could not simply put what we had in the gallery online and hope for it to magically sell. Client outreach through personal phone calls was key whilst we learned more about this new and exciting space. In terms of support for nonprofits, we've continued giving as we did prior to the pandemic to organizations that we follow, such as Chisenhale or Drawing Room, or locally in India to the Chennai Photo Biennale, or to more grassroots initiatives such as the Dialogue Interactive Artists Association, which works with rural artists. Additionally, we've had to bear the burden of supporting museum shows for artists, whereby severe cuts meant that those shows were in jeopardy. This we did by donating in almost all our commission from sales to the museum after the artists had been paid. What meaningful changes have you brought into the way you work and that you'd like to bring forward in 2021? We've made big changes and small changes across our business to make it more sustainable. What we haven't done is just completely pivot. Just to give you some background, we grew quickly and organically from being a small project space to being a full-scale gallery. In 2010, we worked on 2 projects. Our first fair was in 2014. We moved to a gallery venue in 2018 in the Gallery District. And by 2019, we had 12 projects, 6 exhibitions and 6 fairs. We paid scant attention to our own website, which was no longer fit for purpose. And that was one big project that we allowed ourselves to invest in for the gallery, and that kept us busy this past year. We've continued applying to fairs, at least those that we've been doing, as we felt it was important to support them too. However, we started thinking about them a bit more strategically. Pre-COVID, we would not have given a second thought to carbon-intensive shipping and travel, but now we're much more cautious, perhaps choosing to show digitally rather than physically, or showing artists based in the US in New York rather than shipping their works to Hong Kong, for instance. The third question was, how have you explored forms of chance or taken new risks in your work that you think can inspire us looking to the future? I'd say I'm just about to take one of the biggest leaps, which is to show an artist whose work I have not still experienced in person. This is something I would never have considered pre-COVID. In the past, I would have waited to do a studio visit, which might have presented its own challenges. In this instance, As the artist is based in Karachi, and considering that I was born in India, traveling to Pakistan would have presented its own challenges. It just so happened that this artist's work was a perfect fit for our current exhibition, which is sadly closed, on queer intimacies. The gallery is closed as we know, India is battling a very deadly second wave of COVID. This presented then the perfect opportunity for us to maybe show her work online and at the same time as the exhibition in our space, to make a conceptual and a curatorial link between what is in our physical space and what is on the gallery's digital platform. And this is something I'm excited about and something that I think I can take forward. This is a risk that I hope will become a reward that keeps giving. I've since embarked on a series of virtual studio visits with artists in places like Australia and New Zealand. And I've planned many projects. I think a lot of projects will come out of this going forward. There's so many digital opportunities, but there's also intense digital fatigue. So I feel we should be careful to treat the digital space with the same respect and care with which we would treat our physical space. I'm motivated by opportunities presented by video and audio conferencing, either through platforms such as Zoom or social media to engage artists with audiences as well. For Frieze New York 2020, we engaged a writer to conduct talks with each of our artists that we were showing on Instagram Live. As we know, a lot of people in India use their telephones actually more actively than their computers, so we felt this was the best platform. It was super exciting till the one time we had an unstable internet connection. I've also listened to so many interesting talks I would ordinarily not have been able to attend. There's so much that at times I wish we all lived in one time zone. Finally, in terms of arts, museums, and creative sectors, I was asked, what do you think are the key changes that you hope will be brought forward into a sector-wide way of working? I feel we can all slow down a bit with museums, that we can go back to a time when animating collections was the central mission. Special and traveling exhibitions are terrific, but perhaps more demanding on carbon emissions and contribute to climate change. The ability to visit near empty museums is a selfish desire, but perhaps this could be monetized better by the institutions at this time. I'd certainly be willing to support that. I mean, when I go to the theatre, I spend a significant amount of money trying to buy a better seat so I can see more clearly. So I feel like I would be willing to do that to go to an art exhibition as well going forward. I hope that some of the excellent initiatives and very creative initiatives that have come about, such as the Turner Prize being divided among the shortlist or the Artists Support Pledge, could continue, and that there'll be many more such initiatives. I have to say that this past year, I've really enjoyed collaborating with artists and with other galleries, and that's been an eye-opener for me, and something that I hope to continue going forward. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Amrita and John. It's just wonderful to hear both of you from your perspectives in your corners of the world, how you've experienced and navigated this moment. Amrita, I think you're right. And I mean, even though we're not on the same time zone, it really does feel like we're in the same moment. And it's just so fascinating to hear how people have interpreted. I have individual questions for both of you, but a first question that I have that I would like to actually share with each of you from your own vantage points is this question of risk, in particular, speaking directly to artists. You know, I live with artists. I'm always in touch with artists. They're my favorite people in the world, and this is a difficult time. I think, especially because of the difficulty of bringing oneself to risk. I'm hearing, Amrita, you defining risk as something where we can risk being still and slowing down in a world that seems constantly getting faster and moving so rapidly. And with John, you're talking about a sort of mutual trust between a mentor, mentee, an artist, and a supporter. And I think that those are both really, really important. And I'd like to hear a bit more about them. So I wonder, Amrita, given how so much of the world is asking us to move fast and to keep going and accelerate, what would you say to artists who maybe are unsure about what it means to actually risk slowing down and being still and being mindful during this moment?
We, you know, artists are all so different. So yes, I've had conversations with artists like Shazad Dawood, who really been, because he works so much in the digital space, there's been so many opportunities that have come his way that he's just accelerated how he's working. With other artists like Rana Begum, for instance, who's got 2 children and is raising them and homeschooling them and making large sculpture in kind of very intensive studio environments. And sort of, I think, pouring a lot of her own finances into producing this work. I've said to her, think about making different kind of works, or let's focus on. So with her, I've been working on her publication, and I think it's very different for it. It just has to do with your personality. I mean, I feel for me, I have to resist speed and doing things quickly. But as my husband keeps telling me that he's never seen me more focused on on work and spending more time actually doing the thing that I love most, which is actually speaking to artists. And in organizing exhibitions and organizing art fairs and organizing talks and organizing events, I somehow had lost that thread of going out and really just having a talk and trying to learn and trying to teach myself more about the field. So I think, for me, it's been really important to slow down.
Thank you. Yeah, and John, I wonder, as someone who has been a freelancer myself and been an artist applying for funds, you read the boilerplate or the application, and it says take a risk, but then everything within me who's applying for a fund is like, oh well, lean on what you know, like lean on what you think that they want. What would you say to an artist when you're asking them to take a risk during a time where it can seem so difficult to do that?
We always pair artists up with one or more groups of mentors so that they have the advantage of someone to discuss, someone to build trust with, to use your word and my word that you referenced earlier. I think artists are very lonely people because they have nobody to talk to who's going to tell them the truth, but also respect their dignity. And it's important that when one wants to forge a relationship with an artist, one does focus on trust first, focus on continuity and reliability. But also something I'm very focused on is if you're going to give an artist very critical feedback in terms of a project proposal or a project ongoing work or something even more elaborate, you really should do it one-on-one. And I've sat on a lot of panels, on scholarship panels, on drama schools, art schools, Turner Prize, and a whole host of things. And I always like to start by asking the artist, how do you feel about this? What do you think? And then understand where the artist is coming from to respect their, what I call their creative empathy. And then I like to decide where I can give constructive feedback, where I can give career feedback, where I can give commercial feedback, And sometimes if an artist is very evolved and has 2 or 3 pieces of work, or 5 or 6 or 10 pieces of work, I'll say, okay, let's do what I call an exercise that I've done with some very established artists today who are very established brand names that I'm not going to mention now, but I learned this in the 70s and 80s. I say, okay, we have 10 pieces of art here. I want you to pick 5 that you think are absolute shit that we should just toss in the bin and get rid of. I want you to pick 1 or 2 that you think are going to be hanging in a museum in 20 years because they're profound. And then I want you to pick 2 or 3 that are going to be subject to lots of debate, interpretation, reinterpretation, and all of that. And you know, it's an interesting therapy because the artists, they all have views on this and they all know what they think is really good, but they want to discuss it. So it's a bit of a private one-on-one workshop that you go through. And I've done this with a lot of visual artists. I've done this with composers, with short pieces of music, and I've also done it with some playwrights. And you know, the truth is, I try to tell people, you know, Francis Bacon destroyed about 70% of his paintings. People often forget that. Picasso was a ruthless editor, He destroyed over half of his stuff because he'd look at it and say, this is shit. And he'd just gone. And I think today, everyone thinks, well, maybe it'll have commercial value to somebody. And I said, no. Let's focus on the body of your work that you really care about. And you know, I think good gallerists, good curators in museums, also go through that. I mean, I remember when I was on the board of the Tate many years ago, we had a whole debate about Man Ray, and Dawn Addis, Thomas Addis's mother, who's a great curator on the whole surrealistic movement, she said, it's too early for anyone to have a view on Man Ray. No one's really going to understand Man Ray for about 50 years. And I think this is very true about the creative industries. Sometimes we're into this here and now judgment. And I think artists have to realize that they have to have a thick skin. I know it's easier said than done about judgments. They're going to be judged. We live in a world where everything is judged on your mobile phone within 5 minutes or Instagram. But the reality is you have to believe in yourself. And if you've got 2 or 3 people who are advising you, who believe in you, you'll hang in there. And we can think about a number of artists who survived because they prevailed in their artwork. And I remember when I was very young, one of my godparents took me to Andy Warhol's studio, and I used to watch him trace with the projector, and he would trace an image, and he would trace it on the paper, and then he would transform it onto a heavier piece of paper, and then it would ultimately become a basis for a screen print. And actually, I think a lot of people don't realize that the creative process is also about referencing other artists. There's nothing original in the art world. It all goes back 2,000, 3,000, 5,000 years. Nothing is original. Everything is derivative. And I think if the artists understand they don't have to be original, they just have to express their own creativity, then I think they'll feel a lot better.
Yeah. Thank you for that. And also, you know, the little testimonials that you bring up around artists and rejection. I mean, you know, it can really go endlessly. While you were talking, I was thinking about Isamu Noguchi and how he was told by one of his early mentors that he'll never be a sculptor. And it almost seems like, you know, if you don't have one of those moments, then maybe something's going wrong, right? I mean, when I was, you know, focused in the music industry, it was similar. A lot of musicians, you almost got to get signed by a major label and then get dropped before you've actually been considered to have like a true experience. And you know, so much of these dynamics are changing now. I mean, I wanted to stick a little bit with you, John, because I was reading your recent blog post, and you talked about these these T's that go with mentorship, and the last two T's that you mentioned are trust and ties. And I think that those are some difficult concepts, forming trust and building ties during a time when so many of us are living alone or staring at the same faces of the people that we live with. That's our entire world. I wonder, Amrita, when you're thinking about branching out during this moment and working with artists who are not within your geographical area, what have been some of these opportunities to cultivate trust and ties that maybe didn't exist, or that you didn't see when you could travel more accessibly?
Yeah, I think it's, for me, we've never really focused on artists in our local region. When we set up the gallery in 2010, the reason was really to find a space for diaspora artists that hadn't been included or hadn't been represented in India. So there were artists who were pan-South Asian, but might have lived in America or Australia or other parts of the world. And we've built a nice community and become specialized for doing that. So I think now it's almost, it is difficult to build kind of that sort of trust. And sometimes artists want to take their own time with things, and things might take a bit longer. But it's about starting that conversation. There've been times in the past when I've waited to travel somewhere to meet an artist, and it's been years before I've been able to do that. So with this, it's just reaching out for a virtual studio visit. And it's, at first I thought, God, this is really awkward, because not having seen something physically, it's really awkward. But I think I'm becoming really comfortable with it, because sometimes, it's not like these are going to be projects that come about, I have one studio visit and then, we have an exhibition. It's not like that. We have to just sort of feel our way into it, maybe put a couple of works into projects by artists, see how they go, build the level of trust. And I think artists are also becoming more flexible. That whole thing of, we represent 8 artists and we have to show their works over and over again over 2 years. One thing that I've started doing is started focusing on making exhibitions where we can include many more artists together in conversation. Like the current show I have, which is 3 artists who all live in the UK but had never actually met one another, and whose work speaks to the same theme. And now they're meeting as a result of a show in India. They all live in the UK. So I think, so that's how we're rolling with it. So we're not, at the minute, we haven't got anything on our gallery schedule. And we're just saying to artists, well, if you are making things, you'd like to share it, or you have things that you've been holding back in the studio that you haven't shown, let's go back and look at those things, and maybe we can find a way of showing them. So you can send them to us. When things open up, we'll find a way to show them. If they don't open up, we'll show them virtually, or we'll find some way of bringing them out into the world. So that's really how I've been working.
Yeah, thank you for that, Amrita. I have to admit, I'm not the biggest fan of Zoom. And I think especially when it seems like it just sort of was, it's sort of a placeholder. I think that they're very well organized Zoom events like this conversation right now. But we've also all been on things where it's like, oh yeah, this totally they should have just waited until we could go back in person. And but that said, I think about last year I was invited by Diverse Works in Asia Society Texas. Actually, before the pandemic, I had been invited to do a talk in Houston and do a bunch of studio visits. And instead we moved it online, and I've never been to Houston before. And I was like, how am I going to get a sense of this city with a bunch of Zoom calls? And it ended up being quite delightful, because typically the curator would get flown into Houston, and for 2 to 3 days visit like a dozen studios, trying to sit through Houston traffic, getting from one to another in the sweltering heat, and then you're doing all these visits so that your talk actually has to be prepared prior to doing any of the visits, and it normally wouldn't have anything to do with the artist that the curator had met. Instead, I was able to do these visits longer, over the course of over the course of a month, and then write something that reflected on these visits. And it gave me this sense of place that I don't think that I would have had, because with my travel schedule, I'm sure just like yours, John and Amrita, is like, you're thinking about the next place while you're at the place you're in. And so I was curious, with thinking about artists, and also thinking about the people in your field, right? What really binds us all together is art itself. And yes, it's the survival of art and the continuing of artists, but also a preservation um, and an encouragement for art to say what it must. And I'm curious right now, with the artists that you've been talking with, who are trying to balance survival and continuing their practice, while at the same time um, maintaining and evolving the message or the philosophies that brought them to making art in the first place. What would you say to the people in your field? I guess I'm thinking, Amrita, about other galleries. I know that you've been forming collaborative partnerships with galleries, and John, maybe we'll start with you with philanthropy, and thinking about how philanthropists have thought about how they spend and invest their money, and how they may shift that in this period. How do we go about doing that so that we continue to remember what art is here for in the first place, as opposed to just merely a commodity or a thing to fund?
I also felt what John said about giving time was really important, and about versus just writing a check, I think. And actually, spending time, whether you're doing advisory work for a nonprofit, etc. It's, yes, some of it is giving, signing the check, but I think spending the time is so valuable. And I think artists would be so grateful to just have, John's, like a one-on-one with John, and an experience to learn from him. And I would too, just as a gallery, to try and learn. I mean, I'm an accidental gallery in a way. I never set out to have a gallery, but it just so happened that I have one. So I'm learning without network of colleagues, because in our field, you constantly look at your colleagues as they're first your competitors, so it's very difficult for me also as a younger gallerist to I mean, I didn't work in another gallery environment or anything to learn about what good gallery practices as well. So I would love it if there was somebody like John who I could go to, even for that sort of advice.
Yeah. I mean, you're this level of mentorship, and even being able to access for a few minutes somebody that maybe during these times one would not have known where to begin. Yeah. I think is definitely one of the gifts, one of the rewards of this past year. And John, when you mention salons, I think about the community that I grew up in, and or Amrita, when you're talking about other galleries, or how you sort of just happened to become a gallery. You know, like I'm also hearing, you know, a constant flow of risking and reward where it does kind of feel like, well, you know, you kind of can't look back. And then by the time you do look back, you're like, how did I even get here? You know, it again reminds me of, John, what you're talking about when you started off with this idea of someone giving someone else a break, and how in some ways communities are built on people giving each other breaks. And that first break is, I don't know you that well, but I'm going to trust you. Um, it seems to be in so much tension with the way that so many of us in so many fields are asked to present ourselves, right? Like not in front of communities, but in front of followings. And with a following, there's less of an exchange. It really feels like the only thing that you are exchanging are just sort of metrics and numbers for each other, which in some ways is a way to boost one another. But I wonder, given that so many people, their lives have revolved around internet online activity, and how difficult it may be for people who don't have support systems the way that the three of us do. You know, they're stepping into a world where it may seem so different. You know, so many of the colleagues that I work with, the idea of slowing down is the opposite of what they've picked up out of this past year, right? So I guess as a final question to each of you, what is a way of life, a way of working, a way of your practice that you've gained in this past year that you would like to bring into the next year, that you would actually like to amplify and inspire others to pick up, maybe for those who didn't go through the same experiences that you did? I'll start with you, John.
I think it's a very good question, and it's a question that one doesn't want to be too superficial about, or superficial at all about. When I'm faced with a lot of challenges, or I have to do something I'm not entirely sure of, and even if I've thought about it, or if I'm embarking on a new project, and I've created a lot of new charitable initiatives in the last 5 years, in the last 12 months. I always just stop in my footsteps, and I would say to young people, or it doesn't have to be young, it could be middle-aged or any age of someone who's embarking on something new. Everything you've done in your life has prepared you for this moment. So just pause and think about all the things you've done. Because I think sometimes in moments of leadership or management or creative challenges, we forget that we're much better prepared, we're much more experienced, we're much more confident, we have more judgment, and we actually have more sounding boards than we realize. And I take your point about the loneliness of COVID, and I don't think Zoom and Microsoft Teams and Google Meets does body language very well. Body language is something that two people sitting together, talking one-on-one, is something that inevitably allows you to have sometimes reinforced all the lessons you've learned or need to relearn or unlearn in preparation for a certain moment in time, and particularly this point in time.
I think for me, it's really taken me back to the point of why I started in this field, which is actually an absolute fascination and love for the art itself. And as you start working in the field, somehow get further and further away from it. And I think what this year's done is given me the gift of like actually going back and thinking about why I got involved in this in the first place, you know, and if things went really south, what would I still be in this space? And I think I would. I mean, we had in 2019, I would say we had our best year as a gallery. We finally, you know, we were meant to be showing at the best art fair, doing some really strong projects. And it just, I just thought, okay, so this is the time where I can secure the future of the gallery, and I can put some funds into possibly put our savings into buying a space, so that we didn't always have this rent sort of on our shoulders. Anyway, that's all out the window, because we've really struggled a lot with the staff at the gallery, with mental health situations, etc. And they don't have anything to fall back on. So we're kind of, we've become their families. So I think those are the two things I'd say that I really tried to support as many artists and as many of the gallery members. And also this period's really taken me back to thinking about the first reason I got involved in this field anyway, which was the love for art. And I mean, I know Zoom is not perfect and Microsoft Teams is not perfect, but I think at some point we'll get to a good balance, you know, where we're not going to be tearing up, you know, I mean, having massive carbon footprints, flying to Bangladesh for 2 days, or going to, you know, a biennial. If we can reach a sensible balance, I think, with these.
Yeah,
at the moment, it's a little bit trying to figure out what that is, you know.
Yeah, and I think that it's something that we definitely won't have fully figured out by the time we get out there, and so much of it will need to be figured out once we kind of venture back out.
You really have to ask yourself, what are the benefits of doing this? I mean, you know, why do I need to be rushing somewhere for 2 days? You know, so yeah.
Yeah, thank you so much, Amrita and John. I mean, I think you know, just to wrap it back around for myself, I you know, the reason why I brought up my experience with my family is because I think this past year has taught me that I don't need to sort of have family in a separate bucket for my curatorial practice. You know, I think working at a national institution, a world-facing institution like the Smithsonian, it can seem so far away from sort of the day-to-day with a family. And I think so many of us are finding ways to transform just how we frame our lives and how we frame the way we understand and appreciate art. So thank you both of you for sharing this wisdom and your takeaways from this past year. I really look forward to seeing how this transmits and does good to the rest of the world. And also thank you, Bagri Foundation.
And maybe we can all work together on things going forward. This is a connection I would never have made had it not been for the Bagri Foundation. So yeah, thank you.
I agree. Everything happens for a reason.
Yeah. And Adriel, your opening was really personal, really poetic, and it really set the mood, I think, for our chat. I hope we can continue talking.
Yes, indeed. It's so good to meet both of you.
And you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.